Jack the Ripper, a killer who was never caught. In the dark and foggy streets of the 19th century London, fear grips the hearts of the citizens. Throughout the city at night, a notorious serial killer stalks the streets and preys on women. He's known only as Jack the Ripper. The newspapers are filled with gruesome details of the murders, but the police seem unable to catch the culprit. As the body count rises and terror grips the city, one question is heard through the streets. Who is Jack the Ripper? And will he ever be caught? Let's delve deeper into the mystery of Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper was a serial killer who murdered 5 prostitutes in Whitechapel in 1888. Number 1. Mary Ann Nichols. Mary Ann Nichols was a 42-year-old prostitute living in London in the late 1800s. On the night of August 31st, 1888, she was walking the streets looking for clients when she encountered Jack the Ripper. He attacked her with a knife, slashing her throat and abdomen. And the next morning, her body was discovered and the police were called to the scene. The police arrived at the crime scene and found Mary Ann Nichols lying in a pool of her blood. Her throat had been cut from ear to ear, and her abdomen had been sliced open. It was a gruesome sight, and the police were horrified by what they saw. The police began their investigation into the murder of Mary Ann Nichols, but they didn't have much to go on. There were no witnesses to the crime, and the killer had left no clues behind. The police interviewed people who knew Mary Ann Nichols and other prostitutes in the area, but nobody had even seen or heard anything to help them catch the killer. The murder of Mary Ann Nichols was just the beginning of Jack the Ripper's killing spree. He went on to murder at least 4 more women before disappearing into obscurity, never to be caught or identified. Number 2. Annie Chapman. This time his victim was a woman named Annie Chapman. Annie Chapman was born in 1841 and lived a life filled with hardship. She had been married twice, but both her husbands passed away. This left her vulnerable and she turned to prostitution to make ends meet. On the morning of September 8th, 1888, Annie Chapman was found dead in the backyard of a house in Whitechapel. Her throat had been cut and her body had been mutilated gruesomely. The police were called to the scene and immediately suspected that Jack the Ripper was behind the murder. The way Annie's body had been mutilated was similar to the first murder which had occurred just a few weeks earlier. Annie's murder shocked the people of Whitechapel and sparked fear throughout the city. Women were afraid to walk the streets alone at night, and people feared that Jack the Ripper would strike again. The police launched a massive investigation, but they could not catch the killer. Jack the Ripper continued to elude them and committed several murders. Annie Chapman may have been just one of Jack the Ripper's victims, but her murder profoundly impacted the people of London. It showed just how vulnerable women in poverty were then, and how easy it was for a killer like Jack the Ripper to prey on them. Number 3. Elizabeth Stride. Elizabeth Stride was a Swedish immigrant who worked as a prostitute in the Whitechapel area of London. On the night of September 30th, 1888, she was walking along a street called Burner Street when a man approached her. This man was later believed to be Jack the Ripper. The man attacked Elizabeth with a knife and slit her throat, but something unusual happened before he could even mutilate her body. He was interrupted by the sound of a horse and cart passing. The killer quickly fled at the scene, leaving Elizabeth's body behind. It's thought that the interruption may have saved the life of another woman, Catherine Eddowes, who was killed by Jack the Ripper just a few hours later on the same night. The police believed that the killer had been scared off by the arrival of the horse and cart and had moved on to find another victim. Despite extensive investigations, Jack the Ripper was never caught and the murders remain unsolved. Elizabeth Stride was one of 5 women brutally killed over a few months. Number 4. Catherine Eddowes. Catherine Eddowes was a mother of 3 children who unfortunately fell prey to Jack the Ripper's brutality. She was a poor woman who lived in the Whitechapel district of London in the 19th century. On September 30th, 1888, Catherine was walking home after spending the evening drinking in pubs with her friends. It was around 1:40 a.m. A man was seen talking to Catherine on the street corner. A few minutes later, her lifeless body was found lying on the ground, her throat slit, and her abdomen brutally cut. The horrific nature of the injury suggested that the perpetrator was a skilled surgeon or butcher. Catherine's murder caused a lot of panic and fear among the residents of Whitechapel. The newspapers started reporting the gruesome details of the murder, and people were afraid to leave their homes at night. The police were heavily criticized for their inability to catch the killer, and the public demanded action. Despite the efforts of the police and the public, Jack the Ripper continued his killing spree. The murder of Catherine Eddowes was a tragic and senseless act of violence. She was a mother trying to make a living and take care of her family. Number 5. Mary Jane Kelly. Mary Jane Kelly was a young woman who lived in the Whitechapel district of London in the late 1800s. She was known to be a bit of a wild child and had a reputation for being a heavy drinker and a bit of a troublemaker as well. Despite this, she was well liked by many in the community. On November 9th, 1888, Mary Jane Kelly was found dead in her room on Dorr Street. The scene was gruesome. Her body had been mutilated beyond recognition, with her internal organs strewn about the room. It was clear that this was the work of Jack the Ripper. Despite the efforts of the police, Jack the Ripper was never caught. As a result, his identity remains a mystery to this day. However, there are a few theories about who he might have been. Some people believe that he was a doctor or a surgeon due to the precision of his cuts. Others believe that he was a member of the royal family or a high-ranking member of society who could have evaded the police. One thing is for sure, the Jack the Ripper murders were a terrifying time for people of the Whitechapel community, and for people all over the world as well, who followed the case. Over a century later, people are still fascinated by the mystery and horrors of these crimes. The investigation into Jack the Ripper case was extensive. The police talked to over 2,000 people and collected a lot of evidence, like witness statements, letters from the killer, and forensic evidence. But despite all this, the killer was never caught, and the case is still unsolved. The investigation was difficult, and there were a lot of false leads. That means that the police followed up on all the clues that didn't lead them to the killer. Several suspects were later cleared of any involvement in the crimes. One of the reasons why the investigations were so difficult was that the killer was clever. He didn't leave much evidence behind, and he seemed to be able to move around the city without being seen. He also targeted women who were very vulnerable and didn't have a lot of support, which made it harder for the police to track down witnesses who may have seen something. Another challenge for the investigation was that the police at the time had different tools and technology than we have today. For example, they didn't have DNA testing, so they couldn't use DNA evidence to help identify the killer. Despite these challenges, the police worked hard to try to solve the case. They even had detectives working undercover, pretending to be prostitutes to lure the killer out. But unfortunately, it wasn't enough. The police had a tough time figuring out who Jack the Ripper was. They had a long list of suspects, but none of them were ever officially charged with the murders. Let's talk about some of the more well-known suspects. First up, we have Montague John Dreet. He was a barrister, a type of lawyer, and he committed suicide shortly after the final murder. Some people believe that he was Jack the Ripper, but there isn't enough evidence to prove it. Next on the list is Aaron Kosminski. He was a Polish immigrant identified as a suspect by a witness. However, he was never really officially charged with the murders. Some people believe that the police didn't have enough evidence to charge him, while others believe he was innocent. Other suspects, like William Burry, Francis Tombletti, and Michael Ostrog. Each of these men had some connection to the murders, but there wasn't enough evidence to charge them. It's important to remember that just because someone was a suspect, it doesn't mean that they were guilty. The police had a tough job trying to figure out who the Jack the Ripper was, and they had to investigate many people. Some suspects were more likely than others, but the killer was never caught in the end. You might be wondering, why are we still discussing this case well over a century later? Well, the truth is that Jack the Ripper case is just so darn fascinating. Something about the mystery surrounding the killer's identity just keeps people coming back for more. Over the years, countless books, movies, and TV shows about Jack the Ripper have explored a different theory about who the killer may have been. Some people think that he was a doctor. Others think that he was a royal family member. Some even believe that Jack the Ripper never actually existed and that the murders were just an elaborate myth. Despite all the speculation and theories, the case remains unsolved. And that's what makes it so intriguing. People can't seem to let it go. They continue to pore over the evidence, looking for clues that may finally lead to the killer's identity. So there you have it, folks. Jack the Ripper case is one of the most enduring mysteries in history. and as long as it remains unsolved, people will continue to be fascinated by it. Who knows, maybe one day someone will finally crack the case, and we'll know the truth about this elusive killer. Thanks for watching this video, and we'll see you in the next one.